There's a lot to be said about consistency. It will precipitate justifiable mistrust or foster faith. I think that's ironic for at least 3 reasons, but only funny for 2. As trust or lack of faith develops, a sub-process starts. Keep in mind, this is all bullshit, but consistency is gateway behavior. And suddenly I don't feel the need to explain myself. Consistency leads to habits and routines. Nail biting is unsanitary, unattractive, and inconvenient, but the habit itself is just that. A habit. And like a weapon, it can be pointed at anything, like, to quote Mitch Hedberg, flossing. Also, every driver should aspire to consistency. By that, of course, I mean a driving style characterized by a clear sense of purpose, direction, and destination, and an acute awareness of surrounding vehicles and their trajectories. A style which utilizes an economic approach to acceleration and deceleration to facilitate graceful and effortless navigation through traffic while avoiding ever actually being in it. Be a consistent driver, and we'll all get where we're going. I could drive in Sweden. People were very forthcoming with their car keys. Until they discovered I did not have a valid license. It took them almost 14 years to figure that out, though. If I were ever asked to describe local Swedish law enforcement, I would whistle the Andy Griffith Show theme. Even if I hadn't been asked to do it melodically. Not once was I ever asked to provide identification after I opened my mouth. Not once. The way I looked and talked was apparently enough. It was fascinating, disgusting, and I took full advantage. I burned through cops like a 100-crown piece of standard Swedish hash. There was a 2-year probationary period prior to being granted permanent residency. During that time, applicants were required to cohabitate with their significant Swedish citizen others. Any violation or deviation would lead to the denial of the application. They were quite clear on that point, if nothing else. The events which transpired and ultimately led to my failure to satisfy that condition are immaterial, but yeah, I just didn't do that. It's not like we weren't together the entire time, but we weren't together the entire time either. I half-heartedly tried to serve the spirit of the law while tossing the letter of it in the appropriate receptacle or, barring that, a pocket for now, like a cigarette butt, and thought no more of it. At the time, the main office for the Swedish Immigration Services was located in Norrköping. The waiting room was standing room only, colored or white, but I was the only white, and I didn't have time to look around at the black, desert brown, island brown, subcontinental brown, or any of the other colors of faces too numerous to be named anywhere, as I was led pretty directly to an office. It was there I met the official who was to conduct my final interview. He was pushing 50. I would have guessed that a sedentary lifestyle combined with finer things like top-shelf liquor and fancy food made him rounder than he should have been. Or maybe he had a thyroid problem. His fingers were plump. His narrow shoulders sloped up to just below his ears, where they disappeared under the collar of his shirt. This was adorned with a full yellow silk Windsor and a half. That knot was huge. Like a fucking grapefruit it was, I shit you not. The suit was gray. Later that day, I realized his first and only real question was intended colloquially. He asked how it was going, in English. I promptly began to explain the aforementioned immaterial events in Swedish. When I spoke, his chin rested on the heel of his hand. His head cocked slightly to the right, and I want to say I detected something of an expectant smile. He interrupted occasionally to clarify. He asked once if I was living with Maria. That was right after I told him I hadn't been living with Maria for 18 months, and was about to tell him why. Before I could, he asked me why I hadn't been living with her. I said, "Let me tell you why." That was the only English I spoke. Aside from the sometimes feigned attempts to remember a word, that was it. People find that charming, though. When it's done right, it makes them feel smart. Whenever he stopped the story, it was in English. His questions were mostly concerned with my experiences or how I was settling in. But a few just dropped. While describing why I chose to disregard my contractual obligations with sovereign Sweden, he asked me if I fish. He asked if I had been out in the nature. And I see him sit back in his leather chair, his ringed right hand flailing strangely on his gold watch wrist as the luxurious thread-counted sleeve and the flabby arm inside raised them both in an inclined arc, originating where his heart should have been. I think it may be relevant to the story to mention that at no point did this guy write anything down. When I was finished, he asked me if I was finished, and I told him I was. He picked up my passport, opened it to the page for visas and such, and looked at me. Across my splayed passport on the desk, he looked at me and smiled like we shared a secret. Across the passport splayed open on the desk, he said, "It's not like you're from Syria." These were his exact words. He then stamped my passport with such vigor I jumped a little. I think it was maybe a half an hour I was there. I asked the woman who led me back through identical hallways about the people who were still waiting, and was told that apparently the system was set up so that immigration officers were assigned a country or countries and would process the immigrants from that country only. She did not answer my question, but at that point I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Until recently, I never felt guilty about this. I don't think I had recovered from the shock and disbelief until recently. And now, 15 years later, I can see my own culpability. And it was not my proudest moment. But for anyone who has ever shit the bed, it will never be their least proudest moment. And that's another instance of when consistency is important.